Okay, so this video is going to be a continuation of chapter 32. I got to thinking over the weekend about sticky prices and the explanations regarding the recession in the ADAS model. So this is a good time for me to tell you a little bit about two different approaches to the ADAS model. One approach is the classical economics approach. So I don't know if you can read it. I hope you can up here on the upper right here. I've written classical model assumes flexible prices, flexible upward and flexible downward prices. And in that classical model, so I'm going to draw this explanation of what happens in a recession in the classical model. So initially, the economy was at full employment output, which means they were operating on the long run aggregate supply curve right at full employment. And so there was the initial aggregate demand, and there was the initial aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. And what happened to go into recession is that the aggregate demand curve fell to the left, to AD prime. In the classical explanation, once output moves to this point here, Y prime we'll call it, and we've got a lot of unemployment, we're in a recession, workers will work for lower wages, people who own resources, inputs to production, can't sell them, so they will lower their prices so they can sell their inputs. And when prices start to lower, aggregate supply actually starts shifting back to the right. And eventually, we get back to full employment at a lower price level. So here was price level 1 when we began before the recession. And here is price level 2 after the recession, when prices have dropped and we get back to full employment. In the modern world, with industries and the way they are, with labor contracts, with very large companies, corporations that are international, there's a lot of contracts, as you read in the book, for both labor contracts, long-run labor contracts, and there are long-run contracts to supply inputs, to supply resources. So prices are downward sticky. And this becomes what we call the mainstream model, or the neo-Keynesian model. Remember John Maynard Keynes? I talked about him a little bit a few weeks ago. And in that model, prices are downward sticky. So as we go into the recession, let's go to a black color here. As we go into the recession, we get to this AD prime, which I'll now make in black. Instead of coming down here, we move to here. And so you saw that, the ratchet effect that we talked about in the earlier video. Once we're here, if you wait long enough, prices will eventually come down. People are out of work. People can't sell their inputs, their resources, eventually. But what is eventually? Is eventually a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? And people in a democracy are not going to put up with that. People in any country are not going to put up with that kind of a long recession, depression. So in Keynesian model, the government can step in and do the necessary spending to move the AD back to the right, using the multiplier effect. If AD needs to move back to the right by, say, 500 billion and the multiplier is 10, government just needs to spend 50 billion to move it 500 billion dollars to the right. So when government steps in, the AD starts shifting back until we get back here. However, often aggregate supply has also shifted to the left, and we may very well wind up going up a new aggregate supply curve that may come through here and wind up at a higher. So whether we wind up here or whether we wind up here depends on what happened with supply prices along the way. All right, so that's a little additional explanation to the material in chapter 32. Here we're distinguishing between the two models. Now, on an AP exam, if they say assume downward sticky prices, then you use the mainstream neo-Keynesian approach, where we come back along this direction here, and then we move either back up here or back here or somewhere in between. If they say assume flexible prices up and down, then use the classical model, where the way that we get out of the recession is that aggregate supply keeps shifting to the right, and we just move back to full employment at a lower price level. So read questions carefully. Are they telling you to assume sticky prices, or are they telling you to assume flexible prices?